What are the 3 rules of oil painting and how seriously should you take them?
You may have heard about the 3 rules. These are fat over lean, thick over thin, and slow drying over fast drying. Many artists find these rules confusing and either choose to ignore them or are put off using oil paints because they're intimidated by them. So I want to break them down and show that they're all to do with quite a simple concept, which is to increase the flexibility of every layer of your painting and prevent any cracking in the future. Imagine that you put a thin, brittle cracker over a soft, thicker slice of bread. It's way more likely to crack if you press your finger down on it than it would if they were stacked the other way around. So imagine every layer of your painting kind of like you're stacking the bread. You want to start with the more thin, dry, brittle layers and have your paint get more thick, dry slower, and become more flexible with every layer. And you'll make a painting that will last well into the future without cracking. And it's exactly what the 3 rules of oil painting are designed to make sure that you do. Let's define a layer in oil painting, because the 3 rules of oil painting are designed for when you're painting in layers. So a layer just means when you apply wet paint over dry paint. This means that if you're painting wet on wet, using direct impressionistic painting techniques, when the whole painting dries in one go, then you don't need to apply the 3 rules. They also don't apply to acrylic painting because the chemistry and dry times are different. But if you are using layers in oil painting, which we call indirect painting, then you always need to apply the 3 rules. 2 of the 3 rules of oil painting, thick over thin and slow drying over fast drying, are there for the same reason. They're both there to ensure that you don't apply a fast drying paint layer over a slow drying paint layer. If you add a paint layer that's thin or fast drying enough to dry before the one beneath it, then it will probably end up cracking because it's going to be twisted and pulled by the layer still curing beneath. You can even see this effect in nail polish. If you apply a top coat before the bottom layers are fully dry, that top coat is probably going to crack. So you're going to want to check the drying times of your oil mediums and paint colors to make sure later layers don't dry faster than the earlier ones. One way to do this is to use underpainting white, earth colors, or other fast drying colors in your early layers. And start with very thin layers of paint and build to more impasto thick brush strokes towards the very end, in your final layer of painting. The final oil painting rule, fat over lean, is perhaps the most confusing. It helps to know that when we say fat or lean in oil painting, it essentially means the paint contains more or less oil. Fundamentally, oil paint is just a mix of pigment and binder, usually an oil medium like linseed oil. So fat paint has more oil and lean paint has less. So you can adjust how fat your paint is by how much oil medium you add to it. To follow the fat over lean rule as you paint, you can either pre-mix jars with increasing amounts of oil to use at each different layer. You can add solvent into these as well if you want to adjust the thinness, or you can just do what I do and add increasing amounts of oil medium with each new layer on the palette. I have seen misinformation about fat over lean, where people compare the texture of oil medium or other qualities as being more or less fat. But all types of oil medium, no matter how thick or thin they are equally fat. Because another way to understand fat over lean is as the ratio of pigment to anything else that stays in the paint after it dries. Usually the oil and resins from your medium. So fat is the binder in the paint that keeps the pigments together. So when you think about fat over lean, you're thinking about the paint after it's dried. And fatter paint, or paint with more oils and resins compared to the amount of pigment in it, is more flexible. So you want to increase the ratio of oil to pigment with every layer. It can be simple when you're painting to think of solvent as lean and oil medium as fat. But it's more accurate to say that solvent is not fat as opposed to lean. Solvent thins the paint, meaning it applies to the previous oil painting rule of thick over thin. And because it makes the paint so fast drying, thin, and brittle, you only want to use it in the very first layers of your painting. But ultimately, solvent is going to evaporate out of your paint as it dries. And because it doesn't stay in the final dry layers of paint, it doesn't make it any leaner. This all probably sounds quite overwhelming and complicated, but this is why the 3 rules of oil painting are so useful and effective for artists. Because even if you don't understand all the science and nuance, all you have to do to make sure that your paintings last well into the future is to remember fat over lean, thick over thin, and slow drying over fast drying.